If you're training as a journalist, you will often encounter science in its most difficult form: early results, strong headlines, and high uncertainty. This lecture offers transparency and mistrust to sharpen how you read scientific work, how it is produced, evaluated, and communicated, and will translate them into a few routines you can actually use when reading a paper, checking a preprint, or assessing a press release about a breakthrough. Hello, my name is Anranter, and I'm a social and cultural anthropologist and the CEO of Oikoplus, a science communication and dissemination agency in Vienna. So let's start with a newsroom situation. Your shift is almost over, but your editor asks you to process one more item quickly. Several major outlets have already picked up the press release, and there is pressure not to fall behind. The press release has a headline like this: New study suggests a simple daily habit cuts dementia risk by 40%. This is not a situation where journalists intend to get this wrong. It is simply a context where common pitfalls become more likely. Overstating what the evidence can actually support, providing too little context, or conveying a level of certainty that the study itself does not justify. Under novelty, time pressure, and uneven familiarity with scientific publishing, these risks can compound. So, what this lecture offers is two practical anchors for this very situation. The first, transparency understood in a smart way, not as a simple quality label, and the second, mistrust as a professional verification stance. Critical, but not cynical. Together, they support quick routines for handling studies, preprints, and press releases without inflating claims. The key starting point behind both anchors is that even the most sophisticated tools are useful, but they are not truth machines. Unreliable science is rarely just a data problem. More often, it emerges from socio-technical constellations: publication incentives, performance metrics, professional expectation, communication pressure, and institutional routines. And that is why we need infrastructures such as disclosure practices, reporting standards, and trustworthy repositories, and practices, competent checking, careful interpretation, and triangulation across sources. So let's start with transparency. Transparency is often treated as a straightforward solution: more information, more disclosure, more traceability. In practice, however, transparency is quite specific. It refers to standardized disclosure practices, for example, the disclosure of particular data, particular methods, a code, the funding, or potential conflicts of interest. At the same time, transparency is not neutral. It is produced through formats, through standards and conventions that determine what becomes visible and in what form. So for journalism, a key guiding question is: what kinds of traceability does a transparency actually enable? And what does it leave unclear, invisible, or difficult, or even more difficult to interpret? The perspective of anthropologist Marilyn Straddon is particularly useful here. Straddon argues that visibility is never simply more light. When we make things visible, we always do so through specific forms, categories, formats, and conventions, and these do not only enable control and accountability, but they also produce new blind spots. In her discussion of transparency and audit cultures, Straddon warns that transparency can take on a tyrannical side, because there is, as she puts it, nothing innocent about making the invisible visible. Transparency can slide into an audit-oriented logic in which demonstrability and documentation start to stand in for the quality of knowledge itself. A well-documented dataset or a polished repository may be genuinely helpful, but it can also function as a signal of credibility that distracts from deeper questions about design quality, data validity, or inappropriate conclusions that go far beyond what the evidence supports. Finally, transparency and evaluation regimes also shape behavior. This means when visibility is rewarded, attention can shift from robustness of research towards presentability, and in practice, this can increase familiar distortions, selective reporting, sharpened abstracts and press releases, or publication strategies that prioritize output over solidity. A helpful journalistic heuristic to break with the tyranny of transparency is proportional transparency. Applied in practice, that means first to clarify the purpose, the transparency for replication, ethical responsibility, traceability, or public accountability. Second, to define the minimum disclosure you need for fair reporting, typically the method section, the key numbers, the funding information, and any declared potential conflicts of interest. Third, actively look for limits and for what was not measured, what blind spots are acknowledged, and what data may be missing. And fourth, integrate a note on the data quality in precise language, as transparency only becomes journalistically useful when it matches the strength and the limits of the evidence itself. So let's return to the newsroom example. An imagined press release claims that a simple daily habit cuts dementia risk by 40%. The key transparency question is, what is disclosed and what is not? Do we get a link to the underlying paper or preprint? Are methods described beyond promotional language? Are key numbers disclosed, sample size, effect size, and uncertainty measures such as confidence intervals? Is funding disclosed and are potential conflicts of interests declared? And on the not disclosed side, are absolute risks provided or only relative percentages? Are limitations foregrounded in the press release or only in the full paper? Is the causality in the argument stated explicitly or left ambiguous? By mapping what is disclosed versus what remains opaque, you can decide what can be reported responsibly and what must be framed as provisional, limited, or in need of independent confirmation. There are several tools that can support this kind of disclosure check. Unpaywall, for example, helps you find a legal open access version of a paper. Crossref provides metadata linked to the digital object identifier, publication details, links, and sometimes references. Crossmark, where supported by the publisher, indicates whether an article has updates such as corrections, amendments, or retractions. And then repositories and platforms like OSF, Zenodo, or GitHub allow you to inspect protocols, data, and code, as well as version histories. This brings us to the second key concept, mistrusting. Imagine a paper that looks almost ideal at a first glance. There is a public GitHub repository, the data and code are available, the visualizations are clean, and everything appears professionally documented. The risk in such cases is to confuse transparency with validity. Mistrusting responds to this by focusing on structure rather than impression. It asks, what is the central claim? Does the research design actually support that claim? And would there be alternative explanation? This connects to a classical sociological point associated with Georg Simmel. Trust functions as working hypothesis that reduces complexity because we cannot check everything. For journalistic work, that matters. We can neither believe everything nor fully verify everything. The key journalistic question here is therefore, given limited time, what do I need to verify and what level of uncertainty do I need to communicate so that the public claim matches the strength of the evidence? If you want to use mistrust as a professional resource rather than a reflex, you need to think about it as a method. That means to long for structured verification instead of blank doubt. The aim is fairness, where you may take claims seriously but remain open to refute them. To make mistrust operational under deadline pressure, you may use 6 verification questions. First, what is the claim? Is one testable First, what is the claim in one testable sentence? Second, what is the evidence, study, type, sample, and comparison? Third, what is the publication status, preprint or peer-reviewed, corrected or updated? Fourth, who funded it, and are potential conflicts of interest declared? Fifth, what external signals exist, substantial criticism, replication, meta-analysis, or retractions? And sixth, what is a fair conclusion? What does it show and what does it not show? You may notice overlap with our transparency checks. That overlap is intentional, but the focus is different. Transparency asks what is disclosed and traceable, and mistrust asks what the evidence actually allows us to conclude and how much uncertainty we must communicate. Returning to the newsroom example, cutting dementia risk by 40%. Mistrust means if it's observational report association rather than causation. If 40% is relative risk with wide uncertainty, use cautious wording. If the population is narrow, limit generalization. And if limitations are absent from the press release but present in the paper, that gap becomes part of what you communicate. Of course, doing all of this is work, and under newsroom conditions, it can feel expensive. The good news is that there are tools that can support these checks by reducing search time and helping you locate relevant signals without claiming to deliver a final judgment for you. Within this MOOC, the Retraction Watch database is probably the most frequently referenced tool, and for good reason. It documents retractions of scientific publications and often provides information about the reasons. At the same time, in a breaking news situation, it may not always be fully up to date because retractions, corrections, and editorial actions can move through different channels and at different speeds. Beyond status, there are tools that help you map scientific discussion. PubPeer, for example, collects post-publication comments and signals from the research community, sometimes raising methodological concerns, sometimes pointing to potential issues in figures, data, or interpretation. SCite can help you interpret citation contexts. If a paper has been circulating for a while, you can ask whether it is mostly cited in a supportive way or whether it is frequently cited in a contrasting or critical way. Tools like OpenAIX and already mentioned Crossref are also valuable here for metadata and for tracing how a paper sits within a wider literature network. Finally, ORCID supports author identification and publication profiles. This matters because science is still a field where credibility is partly built through researchers' track records and through the reputations and standards of the institutions and journals involved. This should never be treated as a proof of correctness, but it is relevant context when you are deciding how much weight to give a claim and how much uncertainty you need to communicate. To close, here is a standardized short routine for when time is tight. In 10 minutes, you can clarify the claim, identify the study type and sample, and check the publication status through DOI metadata. You can scan for corrections, updates, or retractions, look for post-publication discussion, and check citation context where available. Finally, you confirm funding, declared interest, and key limitations. The last step is the most important one. Write a headline that does not overstate the evidence and add one sentence that marks uncertainty precisely. This is often the difference between amplifying a claim and reporting it responsibly. In conclusion, for journalists, transparency is not only the question, is something disclosed, but what does this disclosure actually make traceable and what remains unclear. Mistrust, in turn, is the practice of verifying efficiently and fairly without sliding into cynicism and without producing false certainty. When transparency and mistrust work together, reporting changes in a very practical way. Fewer overclaims, clearer communication of uncertainty, and therefore higher credibility, especially when evidence is early, contested, or still moving. So if you take only one sentence from this lecture, let it be this: match the public claim to the strength of the evidence. Thank you for watching.